The lobby of Martinez Tower smelled like money. Not the honest kind, not the smell of diesel and sawdust and a paycheck earned with calloused hands, but the cold antiseptic scent of marble floors polished to a mirror shine of leather furniture that had never been sat in by anyone who truly needed a seat of recycled air filtered through systems that cost more than most men earned in a decade. Robert Williams pushed his cart through the revolving glass doors at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and felt, as he always did, absolutely nothing about any of it. He had learned long ago that environments did not define a man. What a man did inside them did. He was 34 years old and looked it not in the way of a man who had lived soft, but in the way of a man who had lived hard and survived. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had been carved by sun and salt water and sleepless nights in places whose names he was not permitted to speak. His hands, wrapped loosely around the handle of the industrial mop cart, were large and scarred and completely steady. He moved through the empty lobby with a quiet economy of motion that would have looked unremarkable to anyone watching on the security monitors. Just a janitor starting his shift. Nothing to see. And that was exactly how Robert preferred it. He had been working for Pro Clean Services for 14 months. The pay was $19.75 an hour. He worked the overnight shift 5 nights a week, rotating between 3 buildings in the financial district. The schedule allowed him to be home when Daniel woke up. That was the only thing about the job that mattered to him. Daniel was 7 years old. He had his mother's eyes, deep brown, wide, capable of expressing more emotion in a single glance than most adults communicated in an hour of conversation. And he had his father's jaw already showing the strong, squared shape that would define him as a man. He was small for his age and completely unaware of it, the way children are when they have been loved correctly. He thought the world was enormous and mostly good. Robert intended to keep it that way for as long as God allowed. The boy was staying tonight with Angela Torres, the retired teacher in apartment 4B, who had become the closest thing to family that Robert had in this city. She charged him nothing, would accept nothing, and pressed a foil-covered plate of food into his hands whenever he came to collect his son, as if she understood instinctively that a man raising a child alone needed to be fed in more ways than one. Robert always ate the food standing at his kitchen counter at 2 or 3 in the morning, still in his work clothes, listening to the silence of the apartment and thinking about nothing in particular. It was one of the quiet rituals of his life, and he did not find it lonely. He had known genuine loneliness. This was not it. He started on the ground floor, as he always did, pausing mid-stride as his eyes tracked the security camera mounted in the northeast corner. The red LED blinked. One flash, then a 3-second gap. Another flash. Robert's pulse did not change, but every nerve in his body went to a different frequency. The rhythm was wrong. The camera should pulse every 1.5 seconds. This was 3. Someone had compromised the feed. He continued pushing the cart forward, angling toward the electrical panel recessed into the wall near the elevator bank. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. To anyone watching, he was simply a janitor adjusting his route. He opened the panel with the key on his ring, the one maintenance had given him 6 months ago, when the overnight supervisor stopped showing up to unlock things. Inside, the circuit board hummed softly. Robert's eyes moved over the rows of breakers and junction terminals with the practiced efficiency of a man who had disarmed more complicated systems in more dangerous places. He used a quarter from his pocket to short the auxiliary power relay for exactly 90 seconds. The cameras, blinking, stopped, then resumed at the correct interval. The security guard, Larry Walker, passed through the lobby at that moment, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone. "Evening, Williams." Robert nodded without breaking his rhythm. Larry continued toward the front desk, a man whose shift was winding down, whose thoughts were already on the drive home and the cold beer waiting in his refrigerator. He had not noticed the camera malfunction. He would not notice that it had been corrected. Robert returned to his cart and began mopping the northeast quadrant of the lobby floor. The breach had been external, probably a probe testing the building's security infrastructure for weaknesses. It could have been corporate espionage. It could have been something more mundane. Robert did not speculate. Speculation without data was a waste of cognitive resources. What mattered was that the building's defenses had been tested and Robert had quietly reinforced them, and no one in Martinez Tower's executive offices would ever know that their overnight janitor had just prevented a potential infiltration. That was fine. Robert was not looking for credit. He was looking to get home to his son. He glanced up at the 40th floor, where the corner office light still burned at 1:45. Whoever was up there was working too hard, or running from something. Robert had learned to read the architecture of a person's life by the hours they kept. People who stayed in their offices until midnight on a Tuesday were not people who had somewhere better to be. The lobby took 40 minutes when done properly. The baseboards, the elevator tracks, the glass panels beside the revolving door that collected fingerprints throughout the day like a ledger of everyone who had passed through. Robert was thorough. He had been trained to be thorough. In another life, thoroughness had been the difference between coming home and not coming home. And that standard did not diminish simply because the stakes had changed. A clean floor was a clean floor. You either did the job right, or you did not do it at all. His phone buzzed in his pocket at 12:15. He did not check it. Daniel was asleep at Angela's. But Angela would not call unless there was an emergency, and Angela's number would show up differently on his screen. This was something else. He finished the section he was working on, wrung out the mop, and allowed himself 30 seconds to glance at the notification. A text from Michael Johnson. "Brother, when you get a chance, something you should probably know about." Michael was not a man who used the phrase, "something you should probably know," lightly. He was a man who chose words the way a sniper chose positions from the highest ground, with the clearest line committed to the shot. Robert returned the phone to his pocket. He would call Michael when he got home after Daniel was safe in bed, after the world had narrowed to the small hours when serious conversations could be had without interruption. He was working the far corner of the lobby near the bank of elevators when the doors slid open at 12:22 and Elizabeth Martinez stepped out. He recognized her, of course. Her face was on the wall beside the security desk, a large framed photograph, the kind corporations hang to announce importance. She was the CEO. She was 32 years old. She had built the company from a small fintech startup into something worth $850 million. And the financial press had spent 3 years writing profiles about her that used words like visionary and ruthless and brilliant in the same sentences, as if those things naturally belonged together. In person, she was smaller than he expected. Not physically. She stood straight and moved with the compressed authority of someone accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around her arrival. But there was something behind her eyes that the photographs did not show, something tight and overworked. Something that had been clenched for too long. She was on her phone. She did not see him. Robert moved his cart slightly to the left to give her more room. Standard courtesy. She walked directly into the wet section of the floor he had just mopped. Her heels skidded on the damp marble. She caught herself against the wall with a sharp sound of surprise and fury. The phone clattered from her hand and slid 6 feet across the floor. In the ringing silence that followed, she looked up. Her eyes found Robert. They traveled from his face to his uniform shirt, the ProClean logo stitched above the breast pocket, to the mop in his hand, and the yellow wet floor sign standing 3 feet to her right, which she had apparently not seen, and then back to his face. And something happened behind those eyes, something that Robert had seen before in people who needed to be larger than the moment they were in. "What are you doing?" "I almost fell." Robert said nothing. He had learned that nothing was often the most powerful response available. The woman's chest rose and fell with the kind of controlled breathing that indicated she was fighting to keep her voice level, fighting to reassemble the composure that had fractured the instant her heel lost contact with solid ground. "Do you understand what almost fell means? Do you understand what a liability that represents in this building?" She gestured around her, at the marble, at the glass, at the portrait of herself hanging serenely on the wall. Her voice carried the particular edge of someone who had been awake too long, who had absorbed too many small failures in a single day, and needed a target for the accumulated pressure. "You're supposed to have the main floor done before midnight. That is the arrangement. That is what this company pays for." The sign was up. Robert's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. He gestured toward the yellow caution marker standing exactly where it should be clearly visible to anyone who looked. "I don't care about the sign. I care about the fact that my floor is wet at 12:30 in the morning and I nearly broke my—" She stopped, picked up her phone, examined it for damage with the focused anxiety of someone whose device was a lifeline, whose entire infrastructure of communication and control lived inside a 6-inch rectangle of glass and circuitry. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from adrenaline and anger and something Robert recognized as the very edge of a person's capacity to hold things together. "What's your name, Robert Williams?" "Robert." She said it the way some people say a word they're about to cross off a list. "I'm going to be calling ProClean in the morning. I want a different crew assigned to this building. I want people who understand how to do a job without creating hazards for the people who actually run this place." She looked at him for another half-second, not as a person exactly, but as a problem that had been noted and would be dealt with. And then she walked away toward the revolving door phone already back at her ear, heels clicking against the marble with the staccato rhythm of someone who had no more time to waste on minor inconveniences. Robert watched her go. He picked up the wet floor sign that had been knocked sideways in the commotion and set it back upright. He wrung out the mop. He continued cleaning. What Elizabeth Martinez did not see, what she could not have known, because there was nothing about a ProClean uniform that told this story, was the small object that had shifted in Robert Williams' chest pocket when he leaned forward to straighten the sign. A piece of metal, military issue, the kind that is not handed out at routine ceremonies, that does not come in a box with a certificate suitable for framing, the kind that is pressed quietly into a man's hand by someone in a room with no windows, with instructions about what it means, and more specifically about what it must never be allowed to mean publicly. He had carried it for 11 years. He did not carry it out of pride. He carried it because Daniel had found it once on a shelf in the closet and asked what it was, and Robert had said it was something from when Daddy used to have a different job. And Daniel had held it with both hands and looked at it with such serious, careful reverence that Robert had never been able to put it back on the shelf. So it lived in his pocket closest to his chest, a secret the marble lobby had no interest in knowing. He finished the ground floor at 1:15. As he rode the service elevator to the second floor, he thought about Daniel asleep in Angela's spare room, probably curled around the stuffed dog he'd had since he was 2. He thought about the pancakes he would make in the morning. He thought about nothing else. He did not think about Elizabeth Martinez. He did not think about the call she intended to make. The second floor was open-plan offices, long rows of desks, glass-walled conference rooms, the residue of a full workday, left by people who assumed someone else would address it. A ceramic mug abandoned beside a keyboard, a granola bar wrapper next to the trash can instead of inside it, a sticky note face up on the carpet reading "Call back," underlined twice. Robert collected these things without judgment. The job was to restore order, to return a space to the neutral condition from which tomorrow could be built. He understood that as its own form of dignity. He had always been good at being unseen. In the field, invisibility had been a technical skill achieved through training discipline and an almost inhuman capacity for stillness. Here it was simply a social fact, a uniform, a cart, a job title that caused most people's eyes to slide past him the way eyes slide past furniture. He had spent months being troubled by this before he reached the understanding that the trouble itself was the wrong response. Worth was not established by the attention of people who did not know you. Worth was established in the private accounting of your own conscience, tallied daily, never falsified. Robert Williams knew exactly what he was worth. He had earned every cent of that knowledge in places these marble floors could not imagine. He got home at 3:49 in the morning. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been constructed in 1962 and renovated just enough at irregular intervals to stay technically habitable. The hallway smelled of other people's cooking. Cumin, garlic, the ghost of someone's fried fish from earlier in the week. Robert had long since stopped noticing it. These were the smells of a working building, a building full of people who came home tired and fed their families and went back out and did it again. He did not find it depressing. He found it on his better nights something close to beautiful. He showered first. Always. He would not bring the chemical smell of the cleaning products into the space where his son slept. It was a small thing, a private rule, but Robert ran his life on private rules because he had learned that structure was not a cage, but a skeleton. Without it, everything collapsed. So he showered, changed into a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, and sat for 20 minutes at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and the specific quiet of a city at 4 in the morning, which was different from all other quiets, deeper, more honest. The city at 4 a.m. was not performing for anyone. On the table beside his coffee was a drawing Daniel had left for him. It was a habit the boy had developed 6 months ago, creating pictures the night before that his father would find when he got home. Tonight's drawing was in crayon green and blue and a determined orange, and it showed two figures standing side by side on what appeared to be a hill with a large sun overhead and something in the foreground that Robert studied for a full minute before identifying as a dog. They did not own a dog. Daniel wanted one with a ferocity of desire that surfaced at regular intervals in conversations that always ended the same way. Someday, Robert always said, "When we have a yard." Daniel always accepted this. He trusted his father in a way that made Robert feel the full weight of every promise he had ever made. Robert folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the kitchen drawer where he kept all of them. There were 47 drawings in that drawer. He knew the exact count because he had never thrown a single one away and never would. He slept for 4 hours. He woke at 9 without an alarm. His body had kept military time for so long that it no longer required external instruction. He went down the hall to collect Daniel from Angela's apartment. The boy was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table eating toast and explaining something at length about dinosaurs. His small hands moved with the articulate enthusiasm of a child who has recently acquired new information and cannot understand why the entire world has not yet been informed. Angela listened with the patient attentiveness of a woman who had spent 30 years in a classroom and genuinely loved the architecture of a child's mind. "He's been up since 6, she told Robert in the tone of a report and not a complaint. "He has opinions about the Cretaceous period." "Dad." Daniel was off the chair and across the kitchen in 3 steps, wrapping both arms around Robert's waist with the full-body commitment of a child who had not yet learned to moderate physical affection. Robert put his hand on the back of his son's head. He held it there for a moment. The weight of Daniel's skull against his palm was the most real thing in Robert's life. More real than the Navy Cross in his pocket, more real than the marble floors of Martinez Tower, more real than anything he had done or seen in the decade before his son was born. Mrs. Torres said the Tyrannosaurus might not have been the biggest one. "Did you know that there's one called Spinosaurus? And it might have been even bigger, but we don't have the whole skeleton, so we're not completely sure." "I did not know that." Robert's voice carried the gravity of a man receiving critical intelligence. "I'm glad you told me. I think we should go to the museum. The natural history one. They have real fossils." "Saturday. I'll check the hours." Daniel looked up at him with eyes that were his mother's eyes, and Robert felt the familiar ache that lived in the center of his chest, the place where Sarah's absence had carved out permanent residence 3 years ago. "You always check the hours," Daniel said with the pleased satisfaction of a child who has identified a reliable pattern in his father's behavior. "That's because it's always worth knowing." The boy accepted this with a small nod of philosophical satisfaction and went back to his toast. Robert met Angela's eyes over his son's head, and she smiled at him with a warmth that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with recognition. She knew what it cost a man to do what he was doing. Her late husband had understood that particular arithmetic. She asked for nothing and gave freely. And Robert had never in his life known how to adequately account for that kind of grace. He made pancakes when they got upstairs. It was their ritual, the anchor of the week's irregular tides. Daniel sat on the counter, a privilege granted only on pancake mornings, and supervised the process with grave responsibility, reporting on the bubble formation in the batter as if conducting scientific observation. Robert flipped them without a spatula when Daniel wasn't looking, the way his own father had once done, and Daniel said, "Dad, how did you do that?" And Robert said, "Practice." And Daniel said, "I want to learn." And Robert said, "Someday when your hands are bigger." Another someday. Another promise the drawer would eventually need to hold. After breakfast, while Daniel watched the nature documentary he'd already seen 4 times, Robert sat with his phone and looked at the ProClean scheduling portal. His stomach was quiet but attentive in the way it had been trained to be, the way it registered threat without broadcasting it, the way it held information without reacting. There was a message from his supervisor, Gary Robinson, sent at 7:53 a.m. The message said, "Call me when you get a chance." It said it in a tone, even in text, that was discernible, the tone of a man who has been leaned on and does not enjoy it. Robert knew what the call would be. He had known since 12:30 in the morning when Elizabeth Martinez walked away from him in the lobby. He had simply not allowed himself to process it until now, because there was a child on his counter describing bubble formation, and that child's world required Robert to be fully present in it, without the weight of what was coming pressing down on his shoulders where Daniel might feel it. He stepped into the bedroom and called Gary. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Elizabeth Martinez had called ProClean at 8:15. She had not spoken to Gary directly, but to Gary's supervisor, Raymond, who had then spoken to Gary. The word used had been reassigned, not fired, reassigned. Gary said this as if the distinction mattered, and Robert let him believe that it did. "I understand." Robert's voice was level. "Thank you for telling me. I'll figure it out." He did not say anything about the wet floor sign that had been in plain sight. He did not say anything about the time, about the schedule, about the fact that the lobby had been started on time, and the sign had been placed correctly, and a grown woman in a hurry had simply not looked where she was walking. None of that would change anything. None of that was the point. The point was that a person with power had made a call, and a person without power had absorbed the consequence. And that was the oldest equation in the world, and Robert Williams had no illusions about it. He sat on the edge of his bed for 3 minutes after the call ended, doing the math. His rent was $1,420. Daniel's school lunch program was covered, but after-school care was $210 a month. Groceries, utilities, the minimum payment on the credit card he had been slowly paying down since he left the service. All of it arranged itself in his mind with the brisk clarity of a man who had been managing tight margins long enough that the numbers had their own weight and shape. He could pick up extra shifts with a different ProClean route, the one that covered the office parks in the suburbs. It paid less per hour. It required a bus at 4:30 in the morning. He noted this and set it aside as a viable option and moved on. The important thing was that Daniel would be fine. Robert would make sure of it. That was not optimism. That was simply the commitment of a man who had already decided. He went back to the living room. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, which happened sometimes when the early morning hours caught up with him. His shoes were still on. Robert unlaced them and set them on the floor. He covered the boy with the blanket from the arm of the couch. He stood there for a moment, looking at his son's sleeping face, at the complete and uncomplicated piece of it, at the way Daniel's chest rose and fell with the easy confidence of someone who had never spent a night wondering whether the rent was covered. And Robert felt, as he always felt in these moments, the specific and fiercely private satisfaction of a man who has built something worth protecting. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The text from Michael Johnson, still waiting for a response. Robert read it again. "Something you should probably know about." He stepped out onto the narrow balcony that overlooked the parking lot and the street beyond and called his old teammate. Michael answered on the second ring. "Brother?" "Michael, you got my message?" "I did. What's going on?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant Michael was choosing his next words with the care of a man who understood that information once delivered could not be undelivered. "You still working that building, Martinez Tower? Got reassigned this morning?" "Why?" Michael exhaled slowly. "That's what I was calling about. I did some digging after you mentioned the job a few months back. Wanted to make sure the company was solid, for your sake. And ProClean's parent company is buried under 7 layers of shell entities. Real estate holding companies, limited partnerships, the whole obfuscation playbook. Took me 2 days to trace it back to the source." Robert waited. Michael was building to something. Michael always built to something. At the top of the chain is a network controlled by Richard Miller. Robert's hand tightened on the phone. "The billionaire?" "The same. He owns 45% of Martinez Capital. That's the company in the building you just got kicked out of. Robert processed this in silence. The gears turning in his mind were old gears, well-oiled, accustomed to fitting disparate pieces of information into coherent operational pictures. So my employer is connected to the CEO, who fired me. It's worse than that. Michael's voice dropped half a register. Miller's security team flagged your file 18 months ago. Background check on all building service personnel at Tier 1 properties. Your service record came up. The redactions came up. Robert closed his eyes. The redactions. The blacked-out sections of his file that told anyone who knew how to read them that Robert Williams was not what he appeared to be. Flagged how they noticed you're not just a janitor. That's how Garrett put it when I talked to him. Garrett Mills. Another name from the old life. Another man who had been there when the bullets were real and the mission parameters were classified, and coming home was never guaranteed. You talked to Garrett. He's doing private security consulting now. Has access to databases that would make your head spin. He pulled Miller's internal security memos. There's a directive from 18 months ago. It says, and I quote, "Identify and remove any personnel with advanced tactical training from Martinez Tower before Phase 2. Robert opened his eyes. The parking lot below was empty except for a rusted sedan and a shopping cart someone had abandoned against the fence. Before Phase 2. Garrett thinks Miller's planning something big, something involving Elizabeth Martinez, the CEO, the woman who just had you fired. Robert's mind was already 3 moves ahead, already assembling the pattern, already seeing the shape of what Michael was describing. They wanted me out of the building before they moved on her. That's what Garrett thinks. You're a trained operator with a security clearance. You notice things. And when billionaires run dirty operations, they don't leave witnesses. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Inside the apartment, through the sliding glass door, he could see Daniel still asleep on the couch, one small hand curled beneath his cheek. I'm not a witness, Michael. I clean floors. You were a SEAL. That's enough for Miller to want you gone. What's he planning? Don't know yet, but there's an SEC complaint. Leaked emails, board pressure, all the hallmarks of a corporate coup. Garrett's still pulling threads. Robert exhaled slowly. The air was cool for September, carrying the first whisper of autumn. Below him, a car turned into the parking lot headlights, sweeping across cracked asphalt. And you're telling me this, why? Because you need to watch your back. And because I thought you should know that your reassignment wasn't random. It was tactical. Robert nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. Understood. Thanks for the heads up. There was another pause. Then Michael's voice came back quieter. What are you going to do? Robert looked through the glass at his son, at the 47 drawings in the kitchen drawer, at the life he had built from the ruins of the one he'd left behind when Sarah died. I don't know yet. He ended the call and stood on the balcony for another 10 minutes, watching the sky lighten over the eastern roofline, watching the city wake up around him. He thought about his father, who had run a barber shop in Baltimore for 33 years, who had cut hair for city councilmen and men who walked in with their last $10, with the same attentive care who had taught Robert by example that dignity was not something you arrived at, but something you practiced daily in the small decisions, in the way you moved through the world when no one was watching. His father had been invisible too, the way certain good men are invisible. The ones who show up without being asked, who endure without editorializing. Robert had understood, watching that man for 23 years, that the inheritance he was receiving was not money, but something far more durable. A way of standing in the world. A way of absorbing what came without breaking your posture. He thought about the medal in his pocket. He thought about the woman in the marble lobby who had looked at him and seen nothing worth seeing. He thought about Richard Miller, a man he had never met who had nonetheless decided that Robert Williams was a problem that needed to be removed from the equation. And he thought about the simple fact that powerful men did not go to the trouble of removing janitors unless those janitors represented something more than mops and buckets. Robert went back inside. Daniel was stirring on the couch, eyelids fluttering. Robert sat beside him and waited for his son to wake fully the way he always did, because there was no version of Robert's life in which he was not there when Daniel opened his eyes. The boy blinked twice, focused on his father's face, and smiled. "Did I fall asleep?" "You did. Did you finish your work?" "I did." Daniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Can we go to the park?" Robert looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:47 on a Thursday morning. He had lost his assignment. He had no idea what his schedule would look like next week. He had a billionaire's security apparatus apparently tracking his movements, and his son wanted to go to the park. "Yeah, buddy, we can go to the park." They walked the 6 blocks to Riverside Park, Daniel's hand in Robert's, the boy narrating a theory about what would happen if a Spinosaurus fought a Tyrannosaurus in water versus on land. Robert listened with his full attention. He did not give partial attention to his son. Whatever Daniel said was worth hearing completely, not because everything a 7-year-old said carried philosophical weight, but because the act of being genuinely heard was one of the most formative gifts a father could give. And Robert understood that everything Daniel would become was being assembled right now, in these ordinary hours, in the texture of ordinary conversations, in the experience of being a child whose father was fully present when they spoke. At the park, Daniel ran to the swings. Robert pushed him, the arc rising higher with each repetition, Daniel's laughter cutting through the cool September air like a bright blade. There were other parents here, mostly mothers with younger children, and they glanced at Robert with the brief curiosity reserved for men in public spaces with children during school hours. Robert did not meet their eyes. He was not here to be seen. He was here because his son wanted to swing, and Robert had promised, and Robert kept his promises. They stayed for an hour. On the walk home, Daniel asked the question he had been building toward all morning. "Dad, when I'm bigger, can I have a job like yours?" Robert considered this. "What do you think my job is?" "You clean buildings. You make them nice for people." "That's right. So can I do that too?" Robert stopped walking. He knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "You can do anything you want, buddy. Anything at all. You can clean buildings if that's what makes you happy. You can build buildings. You can draw buildings. The job doesn't matter. What matters is that you do it with your whole heart. You understand?" Daniel nodded, his small face serious. "Like you do. Like I try to." They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. Robert made grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. Daniel ate his while describing the relative speeds of various dinosaurs. Robert ate his while thinking about Richard Miller and Elizabeth Martinez and the decision he was going to have to make. Because it was a decision now. Michael had made it a decision. The knowledge that his reassignment was not random, that it was part of a larger operation, that it was designed to clear the board before something happened to a woman Robert did not know and had no particular reason to care about. That knowledge changed the calculus. He could walk away. He could take the suburban route, ride the 4:30 bus, come home later, see Daniel less, and let whatever was going to happen to Elizabeth Martinez happen without his involvement. That was the smart play. That was the safe play. That was what a man with a 7-year-old son and $1,400 in monthly rent should do. But Robert had not spent 10 years carrying a piece of metal in his pocket because he made safe decisions. He had spent 10 years learning that some things were worth the risk. And walking away from calculated injustice, from the deliberate destruction of another person's life by someone who had the power to do it without consequence, that was not the kind of man Robert wanted Daniel to see when he looked at his father. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Robert opened his laptop and began to search. Richard Miller, S.E.C. Martinez, Capital. The first result was an article from the Wall Street Chronicle published 3 weeks earlier. The headline read, "Questions Surround Martinez Capital Q3 Projections." The byline belonged to a reporter named Brian Thompson. Robert read the article twice. It cited an anonymous source close to the company who claimed that Elizabeth Martinez had known about significant revenue shortfalls and had attempted to conceal them from the board and from regulators. The article quoted what it described as an internal email in which Martinez allegedly discussed revising Q3 projections downward by 40%. Robert sat back in his chair. He had been trained to read intelligence reports to identify what was signal and what was noise, to look for the gaps in a narrative that revealed where the manipulation had occurred. This article had gaps. It quoted the email but did not reproduce it. It cited an anonymous source but provided no corroboration. It built a case on implication rather than evidence. That was not how legitimate journalism worked. That was how planted stories worked. He searched for Richard Miller corporate takeovers. The results were illuminating. In 2019, Miller had acquired Meridian Technologies after the CEO was forced out following an accounting scandal. In 2021, Miller had taken control of Palmer Industries after the CEO resigned amid leaked email revelations. The pattern was clear. Miller used the same playbook. Identify a target company. Compromise the CEO through leaked information or fabricated scandal. Apply pressure through the board. Force resignation. Insert new leadership. Acquire controlling interest. Robert looked at the framed photograph of Daniel on his desk. The boy was grinning at the camera, holding up a plastic stegosaurus, his whole face alight with joy. Robert thought about the promise he had made to Sarah 3 years ago, standing beside her hospital bed in Pittsburgh, holding her hand while the machines beeped their steady rhythm, and she looked at him with eyes that already knew she was not coming home. "Promise me you'll take care of him. Promise me he'll grow up knowing what a good man looks like." "I promise." She had died 6 hours later. Robert had kept every promise he made to her since, and he had kept them in ways large and small, in pancakes and permission slips and patient answers to questions about dinosaurs. But the promise about showing Daniel what a good man looked like, that one required more than domesticity. That one required Robert to be in the moments that counted, the man he had been trained to be. The man who did not walk away when he saw wrong being done. He picked up his phone and texted Michael. "I need everything Garrett has on Miller, and I need a way to contact his former assistant, the one who got fired." Michael's response came 3 minutes later. "You sure about this?" Robert looked at the Navy Cross sitting on his desk beside Daniel's photograph. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The reply was immediate. "I'll set it up." Robert closed the laptop. He sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the building settle around him, listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond his window. He thought about his father's hands, steady and sure, moving over a customer's head with equal care whether the man could pay or not. He thought about the barber shop in Baltimore, the smell of it, the sound of the old radio behind the counter, the quiet dignity of work done right for its own sake. He thought about the fact that dignity was not a passive state but an active practice, that it required choices, that it required sometimes stepping into conflict when stepping away would be easier. And he thought about the drawing in the kitchen drawer, the one with the 2 figures on a hill, and the dog that did not exist yet, and the word someday that Robert had given his son, like a promissory note, like a contract that would eventually come due. Robert stood and walked down the hall to Daniel's room. The boy was asleep on his back, one arm thrown over his head, the stuffed dog tucked against his side. Robert stood in the doorway for a full minute, watching his son breathe, watching the gentle rise and fall of his small chest, watching the peace that only children possess, the peace that comes from trusting completely that the world will be there when you wake up and the people you love will still be there to meet it with you. "I spent 10 years protecting strangers," Robert thought. "Maybe it's time to protect someone who actually needs it." He went back to the kitchen and picked up the Navy Cross. The metal was cool against his palm, heavy with the weight of everything it represented, everything it had cost, everything it demanded. He put it back in his pocket where it belonged, where Daniel had placed it when he said, "You're a hero, Dad," where it would stay until Robert had earned the right to set it down for good. Outside, the city moved through its nighttime rhythms, oblivious and enormous. Inside, a man made a decision that would change everything or nothing or something in between. It was impossible to know which. It was only possible to act and to live with the consequences, and to hope that when Daniel was older and asked his father why he had done what he did, Robert would have an answer that his son could carry forward into his own life. The answer would be simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Because walking away would have been easier, but would have cost something Robert was not willing to pay. Because worth is measured by what you do when nobody is watching. And because in the end, a man is nothing more than the sum of his choices. and Robert Williams had decided a long time ago in places he could not name that his choices would mean something. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat at the table and waited for morning. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of September dawn that suggested summer had given up without a formal surrender. Elizabeth Martinez stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:15, applying makeup with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual so many times that conscious thought was no longer required. Foundation, concealer, the minimal armor that would carry her through whatever the day demanded. Her reflection stared back with eyes that had not slept more than 3 hours. The insomnia was not new. It had been her companion for the better part of 2 years, ever since the company crossed the 500 million threshold, and the pressure to keep climbing became the only pressure that mattered. She left her apartment at 7, drove the 12 minutes to Martinez Tower, and discovered at 8:30 that her keycard would not open the executive elevator. The small LED above the reader blinked red 3 times, then went dark. Elizabeth tried again. Red, red, red. A knot formed in her stomach, cold and heavy, arriving before the conscious mind had finished processing what the body already knew. Larry Walker appeared from the security desk, his face carrying the expression of a man who had been given instructions he wished he had not received. "Ms. Martinez, I've been directed to ask you to proceed to conference room 3C. Elizabeth's voice came out colder than she intended, a reflex to mask the fear beginning to spiral up from her chest. Directed by whom, Larry shifted his weight. "Mr. Miller's office, ma'am." Elizabeth nodded once. She did not thank him. She walked to the stairs and descended 2 floors because the idea of waiting for an elevator, of standing in a small metal box with her thoughts, was intolerable. Her heels struck the concrete steps with sharp reports that echoed in the stairwell. Each step down felt like a step toward something final, something that had been set in motion long before this morning, long before she had any chance to stop it. Conference room 3C was on the 3rd floor, a mid-sized space with a glass wall facing the interior corridor and a long table that could seat 14. Elizabeth pushed open the door and found Richard Miller already seated at the head of the table. To his right sat 2 attorneys in dark suits, their briefcases positioned with the symmetry of soldiers at attention. To his left sat Thomas Anderson, her chief financial officer, a man she had hired 4 years ago, a man she had trusted with the architecture of the company's financial operations. And beside Thomas sat Melissa White, the director of human resources, her face carefully neutral in the way that HR professionals learn to make their faces when delivering bad news. "Elizabeth." Richard Miller's voice was smooth, almost kind. The voice of a man who had delivered this particular message enough times to know exactly which tone to use. "Please sit down." Elizabeth remained standing. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. She understood with perfect clarity that she was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and that whatever was about to happen had been decided before she walked through the door. Richard pushed a manila folder across the polished surface of the table. It slid to a stop directly in front of the empty chair that faced him. "The board has raised serious concerns regarding recent financial disclosures and the SEC inquiry into Q3 projections." Elizabeth's hands remained at her sides. She did not reach for the folder. "What concerns?" One of the attorneys, a man with silver hair and rimless glasses, opened his own folder and extracted a single sheet of paper. "There are questions about the accuracy of revenue projections provided to the board in August. Specifically, questions about whether certain material information was withheld or misrepresented." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true." Richard's expression did not change. "The board has reviewed the evidence. They feel a change in leadership is prudent." Elizabeth finally moved. She pulled out the chair and sat. She opened the folder. Inside was a resignation letter already formatted on company letterhead with signature lines at the bottom. Below the letter was a list of board members. 6 out of 9 had signed. The word voluntary appeared 3 times in the first paragraph. The severance package was outlined on the 2nd page. 18 months salary. Continuation of health benefits for the same period. A non-disclosure agreement attached as Exhibit A. This is a termination dressed up as a resignation. The board prefers the term mutual separation. Richard's hands were folded on the table. His posture relaxed a man with all the time in the world. You'll receive positive references. The transition will be handled with discretion. Elizabeth looked at Thomas Anderson. Her CFO would not meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere past her left shoulder, the stare of a man who has made a choice he cannot defend and knows it. Thomas, you signed this. His voice was barely audible. Elizabeth. The numbers raised questions I couldn't answer. What numbers? The Q3 email was an internal discussion. I said we might need to revise projections if the European market slowed. That was prudent risk assessment, not fraud. Richard reached into his own folder and produced a printed email. The header showed Elizabeth's name as the sender and Thomas Anderson as the recipient. The date was February 22nd. The body of the email contained 3 sentences. Q3 projections will be revised down by 40%. European contracts are not materializing as forecasted. Do not share this with the board until I decide how to frame it. Elizabeth stared at the paper. Her pulse hammered in her throat. That's not what I wrote. That's the email Thomas forwarded to the board. Elizabeth grabbed her phone from her purse and opened her email application. Her hands were shaking. She scrolled back to February, found the original message, and turned the screen toward Thomas. Is this what you forwarded? Thomas leaned forward. His face went pale. That's not the version I sent. Richard's voice remained level. Regardless of which version was sent, the damage has been done. The SEC has opened an inquiry. Our institutional investors are asking questions. The board has lost confidence. Elizabeth set her phone on the table. She looked at Richard Miller with the full force of her understanding. You altered that email. That's a serious accusation. And this is a serious coup. How long have you been planning this, Richard? A brief shadow of satisfaction flickered across Richard's face before vanishing behind professional neutrality. I've been planning for the company's future. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions. I built this company from nothing, and we're grateful. But fiduciary responsibility means knowing when to step aside. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Ms. Martinez, if you refuse to sign, the board will vote publicly. The outcome will be the same, but the process will be significantly messier for everyone involved. Elizabeth stood. She picked up the folder, held it for a moment, then set it back down on the table. I won't sign this. Richard nodded as if he had expected this response. Then we'll reconvene the board tomorrow morning for a formal vote. I suggest you have legal counsel present. Elizabeth walked to the door. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath her had become uncertain. She paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at Thomas Anderson. You worked for me for 4 years. I trusted you. Thomas finally met her eyes. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. Elizabeth left. She took the stairs back up to her office, or what had been her office until 20 minutes ago. Her belongings had already been packed into a cardboard box and placed on the floor beside her desk. Someone had moved quickly. Someone had been prepared. Inside the box were a framed photograph of her parents, a small succulent plant she had kept on the windowsill, and 2 books she had annotated heavily during the early days of the company. Everything else had been removed. She carried the box down to the lobby. It was 10:15 in the morning. Employees moved through the space with the purposeful distraction of people who had heard something but did not want to be seen knowing it. Elizabeth walked past them without making eye contact. She pushed through the revolving door and stood on the sidewalk in the cool air, holding a box that represented the sum total of her personal effects from a company she had created. Her car was in the parking garage 3 blocks away. She walked there in a trance, the box growing heavier with each step. Inside the garage, she sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete wall in front of her, trying to assemble a coherent thought from the wreckage of the morning. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Text messages from colleagues, 2 voicemails from her attorney. She ignored all of it. The only person she wanted to talk to was someone who understood what this felt like, but that person did not exist in her carefully curated professional life. She had no close friends, no partner, no confidant who was not also a colleague. She thought about calling her mother in Pittsburgh. Karen Martinez would answer on the second ring. She would listen with the patience of someone who had spent 30 years waiting tables and absorbing other people's problems. She would say something kind and insufficient, and Elizabeth would feel worse for having made the call. The silence in the car was absolute. Elizabeth closed her eyes and allowed herself for the first time in 6 years to cry. Not the polite tears that could be blinked away in a boardroom bathroom. Real crying that came from the center of the chest and emptied something that had been held too tightly for too long. She cried for 10 minutes, and when she was finished, she felt hollow but strangely clear. The tears had not solved anything. They had simply confirmed what she already knew. She was alone. She had built her life to be alone. And now that the structure had collapsed, there was no one to help her rebuild. She drove home. She sat in her apartment and looked at the harbor view that had once seemed like evidence of success and now seemed like evidence of nothing at all. She opened her laptop and began drafting an email to her attorney, then stopped. The words felt pointless. Richard Miller had the board. He had fabricated evidence. He had turned her own CFO against her. What could an attorney do against that? Her phone rang. She did not recognize the number. She answered anyway because answering felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than sitting still. "Hello." The voice on the other end was male calm, with an accent that suggested education without pretension. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Brian Thompson. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Chronicle. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the SEC inquiry." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "No comment. I understand this is a difficult time, but I think there are details the public deserves to know." "Then talk to Richard Miller. He seems eager to control the narrative." She ended the call. The phone rang again immediately. She turned it off. The rest of Wednesday passed in suspended animation. Elizabeth sat on her couch. She ordered food that she did not eat. She thought about the email that Thomas had forwarded, the one that was not the email she had written, and she tried to understand how the alteration had happened. Someone with technical skills. Someone with access to the company's servers. Someone working for Richard Miller. By Thursday morning, Elizabeth had made a decision. She would not sign the resignation letter. She would force the board to vote. She would make Richard Miller do this publicly in front of witnesses with his fingerprints all over it. It would not save her job. But it would create a record. And records eventually had a way of surfacing. She called her attorney. They spoke for 40 minutes. The attorney was pessimistic but willing to fight. They scheduled a meeting for Friday morning to discuss strategy. Elizabeth hung up and felt the first small stirring of something that was not quite hope, but was at least adjacent to it. She was not going to disappear quietly. On Friday morning, Elizabeth went for a run along the river path, trying to clear her head. The morning was cool, the sky overcast. She ran 4 miles, her breath coming hard, her legs burning. When she returned to her apartment, she showered and dressed and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reviewing the timeline of events that had led to this moment. February. The email. March. The leak to Brian Thompson. April. The SEC inquiry. May. The board meetings behind closed doors. June. The removal of her keycard access. It was a carefully constructed operation. Richard Miller had moved with the patience of someone who understood that corporate coups succeeded not through force but through erosion. Credibility undermined, trust broken, allies turned. By the time the final move came, the outcome was already inevitable. Elizabeth's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Conference room 3C. Tomorrow 9 a.m. Come alone. Bring nothing." She stared at the screen. The message could be a trap. It could be another humiliation engineered by Richard Miller, but it could also be something else. Information, evidence, a chance. She replied. "Who is this?" No response. She waited 5 minutes, then replied again. "I'll be there." Saturday morning, Elizabeth woke at 6:30. She dressed carefully, selecting a navy suit that projected confidence without aggression. She left her apartment at 8:15 and drove to Martinez Tower. The building was mostly empty on weekends. Security was minimal. She entered through the main lobby, nodded to the weekend guard who barely looked up from his phone, and took the stairs to the third floor. Conference room 3C was dark. She pushed open the door and found a man sitting at the far end of the table. He was not dressed in a suit, jeans, a gray jacket, no tie. It took her a moment to place him, and when she did, the recognition came with a jolt of confusion. The janitor, the one she had fired for mopping the lobby. "How did you get in here? The sub-level door has a faulty latch, been broken for 11 weeks. Elizabeth stepped into the room. The door closed behind her. "Why am I here?" The man pushed a folder across the table toward her. "Because you deserve to know the truth." Elizabeth approached slowly as if the folder might contain something dangerous. She sat down and opened it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper printed side by side. On the left was an email, her email, the one she had sent to Thomas Anderson in February. The text read, "Q3 projections might need revision if European market drops. We should model conservative scenarios. Let's discuss Monday." On the right was the same email with different text, the altered version, the one that said will be revised down by 40%. Do not share this with the board. Elizabeth's hands began to shake. This is my email. But the right side is different. The left is what you wrote. The right is what Richard Miller gave to the SEC. How did you get this? Not important right now. Elizabeth looked up. Her voice came out harder than she intended, a reflex to regain some measure of control. "Who are you? Really?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. A piece of metal, dark bronze with a ribbon. Elizabeth had a brother who had served 2 tours in Iraq. She recognized the shape of what she was looking at, even if she did not know the specific designation. The metal sat between them on the conference table, catching the fluorescent light. Bronze and ribbon, 30 years of history compressed into 2 ounces of metal. "My name is Robert Williams, Navy SEAL Team 6, 2nd Squadron, 2009 to 2017. 3 combat deployments I can discuss. 2 I can't. Retired with honors." Elizabeth stared at the metal, then at Robert Williams. "You're... 6 days ago you fired me for mopping your lobby. I'm not here about that. Then why are you here? Because what Richard Miller did to you is wrong, and I was trained to fight when things are wrong." Elizabeth felt something crack open inside her chest, a fault line she had not known was there. "Why would you help me? I was terrible to you. You were tired and stressed and someone slipped on a floor. That's human. What Miller did, that's calculated evil. There's a difference." Her throat tightened. She fought to keep her voice steady. "I don't even know you. You know enough. I'm the man who caught you when you fell. I'm the man who didn't argue when you fired me. And I'm the man sitting here now giving you a choice. What choice? Fight back, or let him win." Elizabeth was silent. She looked at the 2 emails again, at the evidence of her own words twisted into something unrecognizable, at the proof that everything she had suspected was true. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you need from me? I need you to trust me. And when the time comes, I need you to walk into that boardroom and tell the truth, and you'll do what I'll make sure the truth has teeth." Elizabeth met his eyes. There was a quality in his gaze she had not encountered in a very long time. Not pity, not ambition. Just steady resolve, the look of someone who had decided what was right and intended to see it through. She realized she was crying again, and she did not care. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have work to do." On Monday morning, Robert met Michael Johnson at a coffee shop on Grand Avenue. The place was half empty, the breakfast rush over the lunch crowd not yet arrived. Michael was already seated in a corner booth when Robert walked in. He had aged well, his face leaner than it had been a decade ago, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were the same, sharp, alert. The eyes of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. "Brother." Michael stood, and they embraced briefly, men who had survived something together and did not need to discuss what that something was. Robert slid into the booth. Michael pushed a USB drive across the table. Everything Garrett could pull on Miller's network. Shell companies, wire transfers, employment contracts, it's all there. Robert pocketed the drive. What's the headline? Miller's been planning this for at least 6 months, probably longer. He hired a tech consultant named Marcus Webb. Webb specializes in what he calls digital forensics. That's code for fabricating evidence. Robert's jaw tightened. How does it work? Webb gets access to the company's email servers. He pulls the original message, alters the text, reinserts it into the server with the original timestamp intact. Unless you have the original saved locally, there's no way to prove the alteration. Except Elizabeth saved her emails locally. Then she's one step ahead of most people Miller destroys. Robert leaned back. Who else knows about this? Garrett's been talking to a woman named Margaret Davis. Used to be Miller's executive assistant. She got fired 9 months ago for reasons that were never made clear. She's willing to talk. Robert pulled out a small notebook and wrote down the name. Can you set up a meeting? Already done. Tomorrow afternoon. Same place? Robert nodded. He ordered coffee from the waitress who appeared at their table, then turned back to Michael. There's something else I need to know. Miller sent someone to Daniel's school last week. Michael's expression darkened. Tell me. Robert described the encounter. The man in the black suit. The envelope with the photographs. The handwritten note about Child Protective Services. Michael listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each detail. That's escalation. He's scared. I know. You need protection. For Daniel and for you. I can handle myself. I know you can. But you shouldn't have to. Let me put a couple of guys on rotation. One shadows the school, one stays with Angela during the day. Robert started to object, then stopped. Pride was a luxury he could not afford when his son's safety was at stake. Okay, I'll have them in place by tonight. Robert's phone vibrated. A text from Elizabeth. Can you meet today? I need to ask you something. He showed the message to Michael. She's going to want to know the plan, then we better have one. They spent the next hour outlining the strategy. Margaret Davis would provide documentation of Miller's pattern of behavior. Brian Thompson, the journalist who had written the original hit piece, would be approached with evidence that he had been manipulated. If they could turn him, if they could get him to write a correction, it would undermine Miller's credibility before the board vote. The SEC inquiry would take months, but public perception could shift in days. Robert met Elizabeth that evening at her apartment. She answered the door in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked younger, without the armor of professional clothing, and more vulnerable. She invited him in and offered coffee, which he accepted. They sat at her kitchen table, the city lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I've been thinking about what you said. Elizabeth's voice was steady, but her hands wrapped around her coffee mug with white knuckles. About fighting back. I want to do it, but I need to understand what we're fighting. Robert opened his laptop and pulled up the files Michael had given him. He walked her through the shell companies, the wire transfers to Marcus Webb, the timeline of Miller's previous takeovers. Elizabeth listened with the focused intensity of someone absorbing information that confirmed her worst suspicions. He's done this before. Her voice was flat. 3 times that we know of. Same pattern. Fabricate evidence. Leak to the press. Apply board pressure. Force resignation. Acquire control. And the email alteration web. He's a specialist. Miller's been using him for at least 2 years. Elizabeth sat back. Then she looked up. What's the plan? We expose the pattern. We turn the journalist. We give the board evidence that Miller orchestrated this. And we do it before the vote. When's the vote? The board presentation is scheduled for Thursday the 18th, 2 weeks from today. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. That's not much time. It's enough. But I need you to do something for me. What I need you to practice your testimony. When you walk into that boardroom, you need to be able to answer every question they throw at you without hesitation. You need to be calm. You need to be certain. Can you do that? Elizabeth nodded. Yes. Over the next week, Robert moved through the city with the quiet efficiency of a man executing a mission plan. He met Margaret Davis on Tuesday afternoon. She was a woman in her mid-50s with short silver hair and eyes that had seen too much corporate maneuvering to be shocked by any of it. She brought 6 years of documentation, employment contracts for Marcus Webb, wire transfers from Miller's personal accounts, encrypted messages that she had saved to a thumb drive before being escorted out of Miller's office. "I kept copies of everything." Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact. "I knew he'd come after me eventually. I wanted insurance." "Why didn't you use it?" "Because going public against Richard Miller is a good way to never work again. But if you're already going after him, I'm happy to provide ammunition." Robert took the thumb drive. "What's your read on him?" "He's a chess player, thinks 10 moves ahead. But he has a weakness." "What's that arrogance?" "He thinks everyone else is playing checkers." Thursday afternoon, Robert received confirmation from Michael that Brian Thompson had agreed to meet. The journalist was suspicious, defensive, protective of his reputation, but he was also smart enough to recognize when he had been used. Robert and Margaret met him at a bar in the financial district. Brian was younger than Robert expected, mid-30s, with the slightly disheveled appearance of someone who spent more time chasing stories than maintaining appearances. "Why should I believe you?" Brian's first question was aggressive, almost hostile. Margaret pushed a folder across the table. "Because I have documentation showing that Richard Miller paid Marcus Webb $25,000 2 days before Elizabeth Martinez sent the email you quoted in your article." Brian opened the folder. His face went pale as he read the wire transfer records. "Jesus Christ." Webb altered the email. "You reported it accurately based on what you saw, but what you saw was fabricated." Brian looked up. "Miller weaponized my byline." "Yes." Brian's jaw worked. His hands were flat on the table. 10 seconds passed. 20. "What do you want from me?" Robert met his eyes. "I want you to write the truth." Brian Thompson worked for 72 hours straight. He interviewed Margaret Davis on the record. He verified the wire transfers with 3 independent sources. He pulled records of Miller's previous takeovers and identified the pattern. He called Richard Miller's office for comment and was told that Mr. Miller does not respond to baseless allegations. On Monday evening, Brian filed his story. The headline read, "How a Billionaire Weaponized the Press to Destroy a CEO." The article was 3,200 words. It named Marcus Webb. It detailed the wire transfers. It quoted Margaret Davis extensively. It presented a timeline that showed Miller had begun planning Elizabeth Martinez's removal months before the fabricated email was created. The Wall Street Chronicle published it Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. By 9 a.m., the article had been shared 500,000 times. By noon, Bloomberg had picked it up. By 3 p.m., the SEC had issued a statement saying they were reviewing new information regarding the Martinez capital matter. By 5 p.m., 3 members of Elizabeth's board had called her directly to request a meeting before Thursday's vote. Robert was at the park with Daniel when his phone rang. Elizabeth's voice on the other end was shaking. "Did you see it?" "I saw it. It's everywhere. My attorney says the board is in chaos." "Good. That's what we wanted." "Robert, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have 2 days until the vote." That night, after Daniel was asleep, Robert sat at his kitchen table and made a call he had been avoiding. Richard Miller's private number. Michael had provided it. Robert did not know if Miller would answer. But he needed to deliver a message, and some messages were better delivered voice to voice. The phone rang 3 times. Then a voice. Smooth. Controlled. "Yes, Mr. Miller. This is Robert Williams." A pause. Then a soft laugh. "Mr. Williams, you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. You've made a mistake." "Have I?" "This doesn't end the way you think. I have lawyers who've never lost a case. I have judges who owe favors. I have senators on speed dial. And I have the truth." Richard's voice took on a harder edge. "The truth. The truth is what people choose to believe. And people believe what I tell them to believe." Robert's voice remained level. "You can buy lawyers and judges, But you can't buy back a reputation once the truth gets out. And the truth is already out. Silence stretched across the line. When Richard spoke again, his voice was colder. Your son, Daniel, 7 years old, attends Riverside Elementary. Robert's hand tightened on the phone. You finished? I'm pointing out that you have something to lose. Elizabeth Martinez has nothing. You have a child who needs his father. If anything happens to my son, there's no lawyer, no judge, no senator who can protect you. Do you understand me? Is that a threat? It's a promise. From a man who's been trained to keep them. Richard's laugh was brief and humorless. I fought to build an empire. You bought an empire. With other people's money and other people's lives. That's not fighting. That's theft. Robert ended the call. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage born of a threat against his family from having a line crossed that should never be crossed. He sat in the dark kitchen, breathing slowly, bringing his heart rate back down, reminding himself that rage was a tool only if you controlled it, and a liability if you did not. Wednesday evening, Robert met Elizabeth one final time before the board meeting. They sat in her apartment and reviewed her testimony. She had practiced for hours. She knew every detail of the fabricated email, every element of Miller's pattern, every weakness in his story. But practice and performance were different things, and Robert needed to be certain she could deliver under pressure. They're going to attack your credibility. Robert's voice was direct. They're going to question your memory, your motives, your competence. You need to stay calm. You need to answer every question without hesitation. Elizabeth nodded. She looked tired, but determined. I can do this. There's something else. Robert pulled out his phone and played an audio file. Elizabeth listened to the recording of his conversation with Richard Miller. Her face went white when she heard Miller mention Daniel by name. He threatened your son. Yes. And you're still helping me. Robert's voice was quiet. A man who threatens children isn't powerful. He's desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. Elizabeth reached across the table and put her hand over Robert's. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you. For seeing me. For believing me. Robert looked at her hand on his. The gesture was simple, human, devoid of calculation. He realized that somewhere in the past week his motivation had shifted. This was no longer just about exposing Richard Miller or proving a point. It was about the woman sitting across from him. The woman who had built something real and had it stolen. The woman who deserved a chance to fight back. You're going to get your company back. Robert's voice carried the certainty of a man who had decided an outcome and intended to make it real. And Miller's going to learn that power doesn't fear truth. Power fears people who refuse to stay silent. Thursday morning arrived with hard rain and wind that rattled the windows of Robert's apartment. He woke at 5, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table reviewing the final elements of the plan. Michael had confirmed that Margaret Davis would be at the board meeting. Brian Thompson had agreed to attend as a witness if needed. The audio recording of Robert's conversation with Miller was loaded on his phone, ready to be played if the board needed additional proof of Miller's methods. At 7:30, Robert walked Daniel to school. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with moisture. Daniel held his father's hand and talked about the science project he was working on, something involving plants and light. Robert listened with half his attention, the other half focused on the day ahead, on the variables he could control and the ones he could not. At the school gate, Daniel turned and looked up at his father. "Are you okay, Dad? You seem worried." Robert knelt down so they were eye level. "I'm working on something important today, but I'm always okay when I have you." "Is it dangerous?" Robert considered how to answer. The truth was complicated. The simple version was safer. "It's the right thing to do. That's what matters." Daniel hugged him. "Okay. Good luck." Robert watched his son walk into the building, then turned and headed back to his apartment. He had 4 hours before the board meeting. He spent them going over the documentation one final time, checking and rechecking that every piece of evidence was accessible, that every argument was airtight. At 11:30 he received a text from Elizabeth. "I'm ready," he replied. "So am I." The board meeting was scheduled for 1 p.m. in the executive conference room on the 40th floor of Martinez Tower. Robert did not attend. He was not invited, and he had no official standing. But he was in the building in a coffee shop on the ground floor with his phone on the table and a direct line to Elizabeth. She would text him if she needed him. Until then, he waited. At 1:15, his phone buzzed. Elizabeth's text was brief. "He's here. It's starting." Robert ordered another coffee. He opened his laptop and pulled up the audio file, making sure it was ready to send if Elizabeth needed it. Outside the window, the city moved through its afternoon rhythms. People in suits hurrying between buildings, delivery trucks blocking intersections, the mechanical indifference of commerce continuing regardless of whose life was being decided in a conference room 40 floors above. Robert's coffee had gone cold. He ordered another, barely tasted it. Outside the window, a delivery truck blocked traffic. Horns blared. The city didn't care that 40 floors above a woman's life was being decided. 2:45. Nothing. 3 o'clock. Nothing. At 3:15, his phone buzzed. "Margaret just testified. The board is rattled." At 3:45. Miller tried to discredit her. It didn't work. At 4:10, Elizabeth's text contained only 2 words. "We won." Robert closed his laptop. He sat very still for a moment, letting the information settle. Then he stood and walked out of the coffee shop and across the lobby to the elevator bank. He took the elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened onto a corridor where several people in business attire were standing in small groups, speaking in low, urgent voices. Robert walked past them to the conference room. The door was open. Inside, Elizabeth was standing beside the table, shaking hands with the board chairman, an older man with white hair and a grave expression. Elizabeth saw Robert in the doorway. She excused herself and walked over. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "They voted to reinstate me. 8-1. Miller abstained. Robert nodded. "Where is he gone?" "Security escorted him out 20 minutes ago." Elizabeth's hands were shaking. She pressed them together to still them. "I need to sit down." Robert guided her to a chair in the hallway. She sat and put her head in her hands and breathed slowly. When she looked up, her face was composed, but her eyes held relief. Genuine relief. "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't, but I knew it was worth trying." Elizabeth stood. She straightened her jacket and smoothed her hair and became once again the CEO of an $850 million company. "I want to offer you a job. Director of Security. $95,000. Full benefits. Normal hours. You'd be home every night when Daniel finishes school." Robert paused. The offer was generous. It was more money than he had earned in his entire adult life outside of military service. It was stability. It was a future. "Why? Because I trust you. And because a man with your skills shouldn't be mopping floors. There's no shame in honest work. I know that now." Elizabeth's voice was soft. "Because you taught me." Robert extended his hand. She shook it. Then impulsively she stepped forward and hugged him. Robert stood awkwardly for a moment, then returned the embrace. It was brief and professional and entirely human. "Thank you." Elizabeth's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "You're welcome." They separated. Elizabeth returned to the conference room to handle the logistics of her reinstatement. Robert took the elevator back down to the lobby and walked out into the afternoon. The rain had started again, light and cold. He turned up his collar and headed toward the subway that would take him home to his son. Robert Williams started his new position as Director of Security at Martinez Capital on the first Monday of October. The office was on the 38th floor with a view that stretched across the financial district to the harbor beyond. The desk was larger than any he had worked at. There was a coffee maker in the corner that produced espresso with the touch of a button. None of it felt real. He spent the first week learning the infrastructure. The building had 42 cameras, 16 motion sensors, 3 points of entry, and a security staff of 8 people working rotating shifts. The previous director had left 6 months earlier after failing to identify a data breach that cost the company $200,000. Elizabeth had operated without a security director since then, relying on Larry Walker and the overnight team while she fought to keep her company. Robert reviewed every camera feed, every access log, every maintenance record from the past year. He found 17 vulnerabilities. 12 required procedural fixes and better training. 5 were serious. One was the faulty sub-level door latch he had used to enter the building. He filed a work order to have it repaired, then thought better of it and fixed it himself with tools from the maintenance closet. Some knowledge was better kept private. On his second Friday, Elizabeth called him to her office. She was behind her desk, working through contracts that had piled up during her forced absence. The board had reinstated her but appointed an oversight committee to review all major decisions for 6 months. It was a compromise that tasted like defeat, even in victory. "How's the transition going, Smooth? Your team is solid. They just needed structure." Elizabeth gestured to the chair. "Sit. I want to ask you something." Robert sat. The chair was the same one he had occupied when she offered him this job. It felt different now. The board wants new financial controls, more oversight, more reporting, more checks. They're not wrong to ask, but it's also a vote of no confidence dressed up as prudence. Robert waited. Elizabeth had not called him here to discuss board politics. She leaned back. "I need someone I can trust. Someone who doesn't have a stake in the internal politics. Someone who will tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable. That's not a security question. No, but you're the only person in this building I'm certain isn't working for someone else." Robert considered this. The statement was true. It was also a heavy burden to place on a friendship barely a month old. "What do you need?" "I need you to audit the financial department. Specifically, I need to know how Thomas Anderson was compromised." Miller didn't just plant evidence. He turned my CFO against me. I need to know how. That's outside my job description. "I know, but I'm asking anyway." Robert looked at her. The woman behind the desk was composed, professional, in command. But underneath was a recognition that the victory they had won was fragile, built on evidence and public pressure rather than genuine trust. "If I find something you might not like what it means, I understand." Robert spent the next week quietly investigating Thomas Anderson. The CFO had returned to work the day after the board vote, his desk and access restored as if nothing had happened. Elizabeth had not fired him. Robert suspected this was strategic. Firing Thomas would look like retaliation and give Miller's allies ammunition. Robert started with Thomas's financial records, bank statements, credit card transactions, mortgage payments. The picture was unremarkable. A man living slightly beyond his means, carrying $30,000 in credit card debt, making minimum payments. Not desperate, not wealthy, just comfortable. Then Robert found the wire transfer. $25,000 deposited into Thomas Anderson's account on February 8th, 2 weeks before the fabricated email. The source was listed as a consulting fee from Apex Advisory Solutions. Robert traced the firm through 3 holding companies before finding Richard Miller's signature at the end of the chain. He printed the records and walked 2 floors up. Elizabeth was on a conference call. He waited until she finished. "I found it." He handed her the folder. She read in silence. Her hands gripped the pages tighter with each line. When she finished, she set the folder down. He paid him. $25,000. 2 weeks before the email. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window. She stared out at the harbor for a long time. "How long have you known I confirmed it this morning? Wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." "What do you think I should do?" Robert chose his words carefully. "That's not my decision. But if you keep him, everyone will know you know. If you fire him, Miller's people will say you're purging critics." Elizabeth turned back. She pulled the folder toward her and read it again. "Thank you for finding this. What are you going to do? I don't know yet." The consequence came 3 days later. Thomas Anderson resigned, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend time with family. The announcement was brief and professional. Elizabeth accepted his resignation effective immediately and named the deputy CFO as acting chief. There was no mention of the $25,000, no public accusation. Thomas simply disappeared. Robert understood the calculus. Elizabeth could have exposed him, could have turned evidence over to prosecutors, could have made an example, But doing so would extend the scandal, give Miller's allies more ammunition, keep the company in the news for wrong reasons. So she let him go quietly. It was pragmatic. It was also the decision of someone who had learned that winning ugly was still winning. November arrived with shorter days and colder nights. Robert settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. He woke at 6, made breakfast for Daniel, walked him to school, and arrived at Martinez Tower by 8:30. He worked until 5, managing the security team and implementing upgrades. He picked up Daniel from after-school care, made dinner, helped with homework, put his son to bed by 8:30. Then he reviewed the day's security logs, looking for patterns, looking for the next threat before it materialized. In mid-November, Elizabeth invited Robert and Daniel to the Natural History Museum. Daniel had been asking to go for months, ever since that morning conversation about Spinosaurus. They met on a Sunday afternoon, bundled against the cold, and spent 3 hours walking through halls of bones and minerals. Daniel was in heaven, reading every placard, asking questions that stumped tour guides, insisting they see the dinosaur exhibit twice. Elizabeth kept pace with his enthusiasm, never suggesting they slow down or skip sections. She asked her own questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. At one point, standing before a Tyrannosaurus skeleton, Daniel looked up at her. "Do you like dinosaurs? I'm learning to. My dad says learning is how you get better at things. Your dad is right about a lot of things." Daniel considered this. "Do you like my dad?" Elizabeth glanced at Robert, then back to Daniel. "Yes, I do. Very much." "Good. He's the best dad in the world." "I believe that." They ate dinner at the museum cafe, overpriced sandwiches that Daniel consumed while describing his favorite exhibits. Robert watched Elizabeth listen, watched the genuine affection in her expression, and felt something settle in his chest. A decision that had been forming for weeks crystallized into clarity. After they left, they walked through the cold evening toward the subway. Daniel ran ahead, chasing pigeons, his laughter echoing off buildings. Elizabeth walked beside Robert, their hands nearly touching. "Thank you for today." Her voice was soft. "I haven't had this much fun in years. Thank you for coming." It meant a lot to Daniel. And to me. She looked up at him. "Robert, I need to tell you something." "Okay. I'm falling for you. I know that complicates everything. I know we work together and you have Daniel to think about, but I needed you to know." Robert stopped walking. They were standing on a corner, the city moving around them, Daniel visible 50 feet ahead, investigating a storefront window. He looked at Elizabeth and saw vulnerability and hope and fear mixed in her expression. "It's not what I signed up for, but it's what I want." "Are you sure?" "No. But I haven't been sure about anything since Sarah died. I'm learning to move forward anyway." Elizabeth smiled. "That sounds like progress." He took her hand. The gesture was simple but carried weight, an acknowledgement of what had been unspoken, and a promise of what might come. They stood there for a moment, hands linked, breath visible in the cold air. Then Daniel called from down the block, and they walked forward together. December brought freezing rain. The SEC investigation was formally dropped on the 15th, a brief statement citing insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. Elizabeth called Robert to her office when the news came through. They found evidence of email alteration. They found wire transfers to Marcus Webb. But they're not moving forward because Miller's attorneys argued statute of limitations and said the harm was primarily civil. That's not justice. "No. But I have my company back." She looked at him. "That has to be enough." "Does it?" Elizabeth turned from the window. Her expression held exhaustion and resignation and something harder. "It has to be." Robert understood. Pursuing Miller further would take years and cost millions with no guarantee of success. Elizabeth had chosen to move forward rather than remain tethered to the past. It was a choice he recognized. He had made similar ones. "What about you?" Elizabeth asked. "Are you okay with how this ended? I didn't do it for justice. I did it because you deserved a chance to fight back. You got that chance. You won. That's enough for me." She crossed the room and hugged him. It was brief and professional and entirely human. "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome." Over the next month, Robert and Elizabeth began seeing each other outside of work. careful dates that accommodated Daniel's schedule and the complexity of their professional relationship. They went to movies and once to a concert Elizabeth had tickets for. They talked about their pasts and their hopes, and the careful work of building something new from pieces of lives that had been broken and reassembled. One evening in late January, after Daniel was in bed, Elizabeth sat at Robert's kitchen table while he made coffee. She had been there enough times now that it felt natural, her presence no longer requiring explanation. Robert brought 2 mugs and sat across from her. "I've been thinking about something." Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the mug. "About us. About where this is going." Robert waited. "I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to pretend this is casual. I care about you. I care about Daniel. I want to be part of your lives in a real way. What does that look like? I don't know exactly. But I know I want to find out." Robert reached across the table and took her hand. "You've shown me who you are when it costs you something. That's what matters." She squeezed his hand. "So where do we go from here?" "Forward. Together. One step at a time." They sat in the quiet kitchen, hands linked across the table. 2 people who had found each other in circumstances neither had planned for, who had built trust through crisis and maintained it through the harder work of ordinary days. In March, Robert began looking at houses in Riverside. The neighborhood had better schools and safer streets and yards where children could play. He found a 2-bedroom with a small backyard, enough space for a garden, enough space for a dog. He signed the lease on a Saturday afternoon with Elizabeth beside him, Daniel running through the empty rooms claiming which would be his. They moved in on the 1st of April. Angela helped them unpack, fussing over furniture placement and offering advice about curtains. Elizabeth came by in the evening with groceries and helped christen the new kitchen by making dinner together, the 3 of them moving around the space in the careful choreography of people learning to share. After dinner, Daniel went outside to explore the yard. Robert and Elizabeth stood at the window watching him map the boundaries of his new territory. "He's happy." "He is. Are you?" Robert thought about the path that had brought him here, from military service to grief to cleaning floors in a building where he was invisible. He thought about the medal in his pocket and the promises he had made and the life he had built through small decisions and steady work. He thought about the woman standing beside him who had been a stranger and become a partner. "Yes, I'm happy." "Good, because I am too." Daniel called from the backyard. He had found something, probably a bug, and wanted his father to identify it. Robert kissed Elizabeth's temple and went outside. She followed, and they stood together in the spring evening while Daniel explained his discovery with the seriousness of a scientist. Later, after Daniel was in bed in his new room after Elizabeth had driven home, Robert sat on the back steps and looked up at the stars. They were faint here, washed out by city lights, but visible enough to remind him of things larger than himself, older than his problems, constant in ways human concerns were not. The back door opened. Daniel stood in the doorway in his pajamas, the stuffed dog tucked under one arm. "Can't sleep." Robert patted the step beside him. "Come sit." Daniel sat. They looked at the stars in comfortable silence. After a while, Daniel spoke. "Dad, are we going to get a dog now?" Robert put his arm around his son. "Yeah, buddy, we are. Really. We'll go to the shelter next weekend. You can pick one out." Daniel leaned against his father's side. "This is the best house ever." "I'm glad you think so." "Dad." "Yeah. Is Elizabeth going to be part of our family?" Robert considered how to answer. The relationship was still finding its shape, but Daniel deserved honesty. "I think so, if that's okay with you." "It's okay. I like her, and she makes you smile." Robert tightened his arm around his son. "You make me smile too." "I know, but it's different. She makes you smile like Mom used to." The observation struck Robert with unexpected force. He had not realized how visible his happiness was, how clearly Daniel could read the emotional weather of his father's life. "Is that okay? That she makes me smile like that?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I think Mom would want you to be happy." Robert's eyes stung. He blinked hard. "I think so too." They sat together until Daniel started yawning. Robert carried him inside and tucked him into bed and stood in the doorway of the new room in the new house. Tomorrow, there would be work. There would be the ordinary challenges of raising a child and maintaining a relationship and doing a job well. But tonight, there was this: a sleeping boy, a house with a yard, a future that held possibility. Robert walked back through the quiet house. He picked up his phone and texted Elizabeth. "Daniel wants to know if you're part of our family." Her response came quickly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I think so." And what do you think? Robert looked around the house, at the boxes still unpacked, at the life still being assembled piece by piece, at the space that had opened up for someone else to enter if she chose to. "I think you already are." "Good. Because I don't want to be anywhere else." Robert set down the phone. He went to the kitchen and opened the drawer where he had placed the drawings Daniel had made over the years. 48 small records of a child's love and a father's care. He added tonight's drawing the picture of 3 people and a dog standing together under a sun that took up half the page. 49 now. He closed the drawer and turned off the lights. In the morning he would wake and make pancakes. He would text Elizabeth and invite her for breakfast. He would show up at work on Monday and do his job well because work mattered and doing things right mattered, and the example he set for his son mattered more than anything else in the world. On Saturday they went to the animal shelter on Riverside Avenue. Daniel had researched dog breeds for a week, reading library books and watching videos, preparing for this moment with the dedication of a child who understood that some decisions required serious thought. The shelter was crowded with families, the air filled with barking, and the particular smell of too many animals in too small a space. Daniel walked slowly past the kennels, studying each dog with grave attention. Robert and Elizabeth followed, hands linked, letting the boy make his own choice. Near the back, Daniel stopped in front of a kennel holding a golden retriever mix, maybe 2 years old, with one ear that flopped forward and eyes that held equal parts hope and resignation. This one. The shelter volunteer opened the kennel. The dog approached Daniel carefully, tail wagging in tentative half circles, waiting to see if this was real or another disappointment. Daniel knelt and extended his hand. The dog sniffed it, then licked it, then pressed his whole body against the boy's legs with the desperate affection of a creature that had been waiting for exactly this. "Can we get him, Dad?" Robert looked at the dog, at his son, at Elizabeth standing beside him with tears in her eyes. "Yeah, buddy, we can." They named him Captain. The drive home was chaotic, the dog anxious in the unfamiliar car, Daniel talking to him in a steady stream of reassurance. When they arrived at the house, Captain bounded into the backyard like he had been waiting his whole life for exactly this yard, this family, this moment. Robert stood at the back door watching Daniel and Captain chase each other in circles. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. "You did it. All the some days. You kept every promise. Not all of them. Not yet." She looked up at him. "What's left?" Robert turned to face her. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. "This." He knelt down on one knee. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. "I don't have a ring yet. I wanted to ask Daniel first, and I did last night." He said yes before I finished the question. Elizabeth Martinez. "I know this has been fast. I know we're still figuring things out. But I also know I don't want to figure them out without you. Will you marry me?" Elizabeth was crying, nodding before she could speak. "Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes." Robert stood and she threw her arms around him and they held each other while Daniel and Captain played in the yard, oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed, that the family they had been becoming was now going to be made official, that the some days had turned into certainties. That evening, after Daniel was asleep and Captain was curled on a blanket in the corner, and Elizabeth had gone home with a promise to return in the morning, Robert sat at the kitchen table one last time as a man whose future was still being written. Tomorrow he would wake as a man engaged to be married. Tomorrow the next chapter would begin. But tonight he allowed himself this moment of reflection. He thought about the lobby of Martinez Tower and the woman who had slipped on a wet floor. He thought about the moment he could have let it pass, could have accepted the reassignment, could have stayed invisible. He thought about the choice to step forward instead of back, to help instead of ignore, to risk instead of retreat. A man is the sum of his choices. Robert had made his, had walked toward hard things, had helped someone who needed help, had accepted help when offered, had let himself be seen and chosen to see in return. The choices had cost him something. They had also given him everything that mattered. He picked up his phone and sent one final text to Michael. "Remember when you asked what I was going to do?" Michael's response came immediately. "I remember. I'm getting married." There was a pause. Then, "Brother, I'm happy for you. She's a good woman. The best. And Daniel, already planning the wedding, wants Captain to be the ring bearer. Of course he does." Robert smiled. He set down the phone and walked through his house, checking locks, turning off lights, doing the small tasks that marked the end of a day. In Daniel's room, he adjusted the blanket and kissed his son's forehead. Captain raised his head from his blanket, thumped his tail once, and went back to sleep. Robert went to his own room and lay down in the darkness. Through the window he could see the stars, faint but present, constant and indifferent, and somehow reassuring. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tomorrow would require its own choices. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Robert Williams went to sleep without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on his chest. He had built something worth protecting. He had kept the promises that mattered. He had shown his son what it looked like to be a good man, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through the accumulated testimony of small decisions made correctly daily without fanfare. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Riverside and Daniel came running into his room with Captain at his heels shouting that Elizabeth had texted and was bringing donuts for breakfast, Robert would wake to a life he had earned through every hour of every night he had spent mopping floors in a building where no one saw him. But they saw him now. His son saw him. Elizabeth saw him. And most importantly, Robert saw himself clearly for the first time since Sarah died, saw a man who had survived loss and found purpose and built a future from the ruins of the past. The medal was still in his pocket. It would always be there. But it was no longer the thing that defined him. What defined him now was the boy sleeping down the hall, the woman who had said yes, the dog breathing softly in the corner, the house with a yard, the job he did well, the promises he kept. "Worth isn't measured by salary or title," he had told Elizabeth. "It's measured by what you do when nobody's watching." Robert had done the work when nobody was watching. And now, in the quiet darkness of his own room, in his own house, he could finally rest in the knowledge that the work had been enough. He closed his eyes and slept. And his sleep was deep and dreamless and peaceful in the way that comes only to those who have carried their burdens faithfully and set them down at last in safe places, surrounded by people who know them and choose them and whom they have chosen in return. The story of Robert Williams, who cleaned floors and saved a CEO and built a family from the pieces of a broken life, was not a story about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was a story about showing up, about doing the right thing when it cost something, about being seen and choosing to see in return. It was a story about a father and a son and a woman who had all been alone and found each other, about second chances and kept promises and the quiet dignity of work done right. It was in the end a story about what it means to be a good man. And Robert Williams, director of security at Martinez Capital, father to Daniel, fiancé to Elizabeth, had become exactly that. Not because he carried a medal, not because he had once been a SEAL, but because when it mattered, when everything was on the line, he had made the choice to step forward instead of back, and that choice had made all the difference.